Welcome everyone to CG webinar. I think we're the second for the year and 178th seminar in our series, which is we're now in the 6th year of those seminars. It's great to be able to welcome our colleagues from US and Bangladesh. We've got Riyad Shahjahan with us and Emma Tasnim and Niloy Nisharggo. So we're, for the first time, going to take our webinars to Bangladesh, the situation inside Bangladesh, and a really large country, large education system, important source of intellectual contribution, and it'll be great to hear about faculty life and navigating timescapes and faculty life in the urban global south. So welcome everyone, and let me run you quickly through the webinar protocols. Remember that the webinar is being recorded, and we'll post the recording on YouTube. We tend to find there's more take up of our webinars on YouTube now than there is in the participant hour when the webinars are presented. We'll also post the chat. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but do turn it on when you come in to ask your question. We recommend using speaker view setting in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function. Put your questions in writing and forward them through the chat, and we'll select from the questions in the chat for the Q&A session itself. If questions that come in early always tend to be included. Questions that come in very late in the session sometimes don't. So I advise you to be curious as soon as possible and put your curiosity into writing as soon as possible. When you're asked to come into the webinar and put your question verbally, please unmute yourself, most important step. Switch on your video and state your name and where you're from, and then ask your question. So happy now to introduce our three speakers, and I'll introduce them at the beginning so they have the opportunity to manage the webinar between them, each other as we go, rather than being interrupted by me doing introductions. Riyad Shahjahan is a noted scholar in our field of higher education studies. His work is being watched increasingly around the world, and we've set a number of his papers for our current Oxford module in the MSc program on higher education. He's an associate professor of higher adult and lifelong learning, HALE, H-A-L-E, at Michigan State University. He's also a core faculty member of Muslim Studies, Chicano-Latino Studies, Asian Studies Center, and the Center for Advanced Study of International Development, which gives you some idea of Riyad's broad connections and interests. His areas of research in globalization of higher education policy, temporality, and that's an increasing theme in his work, and embodiment in higher education, cultural studies, and and anti-post-colonial and post-colonial theory. So decolonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial theory. Tasnim Emma, and we'll use Emma as her name in the session, is an undergraduate student at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh. Her interests primarily include medical anthropology, the political economy of health and illness, and political ecology and migration. And Nisharggo Niloy, who we'll call Niloy, completed his postgraduate work from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Dhaka. His interests include political communication in the public sphere, modernity in South Asia, partisan tendencies in South Asian politics, which we've had quite a lot of discussion of in previous webinars, and neocolonialism, rhetoric, and semiotics. So a very accomplished panel, and I'm going to hand over to you, Riyad, at this point, and ask you to organize the panel and the presentations, and then I'll come back in for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Good morning to those like us who are in North America. Good afternoon to those who are in the UK and Europe, and to my colleagues in Asia, good evening. Okay, so let me quickly share my screen and then we'll go from there. Okay, so as Simon, thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you, Trevor, for organizing this as well. It's a delight for us to be here to talk about a topic that I've been researching on, temporality in higher education, but most of the time it's always been about the global north. Most of the studies that take place on temporality in higher education tends to be about faculty working within the context of North American or Western European university context. And usually the themes that emerge from those conversations have been around the area of acceleration, speed, digitization, affective impulses in terms of stress, anxiety, and so forth, due to neoliberal performativity, things like that. That has been most of the time the debates that's been going on in temporality in higher education. But I think what's missing in that whole body of literature is what's going on in the global south. And there's one colleague of ours, Caroline Guzman Valenzuela, as well as Ronald Barnett, who's written one of the only pieces on timescapes in the context of Chile. That's about it. Most of the conversations have mostly been about the global north. So really, this study really tries to kind of complicate that literature. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is, get straight into. I'm not sure why it's not working. Just give me a second. Okay, there you go. I just wanted to quickly share a quick narrative, just to give you set the context. So this is social sciences. Suddenly come up. Can people hear me fine?
Only some of the time. We're losing you a little, just in the last 30 seconds or so.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me fine now?
Yes.
Okay, apologies. I think it's what's going on is in my household, we have so many people on Zoom. My kid's in school right now, so we're using their Zoom, my Zoom. Anyway, so going back to Shobuj is someone who's actually got his PhD in the West. And here he's just sharing his experiences in navigating temporality in the West versus what his life is like in Bangladesh. And by temporality, what I mean is the way we relate and make sense of temporal changes in our lives. So he says here, for instance, that I used to plan before, but then I realized in my situation in Bangladesh, plans just simply don't work. So I have given up planning. Now I adapt to the situation. Nothing is predictable. Unpredictability is very high. So then we asked him, is it because of people? He's like, no, it's not just people. It's also culture. Because he then talks about how meetings take longer than they expect because people talk more than they should. You can't stick to the agenda. So the point he says is in global north, everything was under my control. But here, you never know what happens when, and uncertainty. So in other words, what Shobuj is raising here is he's raising questions about temporal inefficiencies, both in the terms of traffic, both in terms of meetings. And for him, time management is a misnomer. It's a misnomer. It just doesn't seem to exist for him because he uses his predictable West time map to articulate what time is like in the context of Dhaka in Bangladesh. Yet these are the kinds of narratives that we see missing in the temporality in higher education literature. Okay. I'm going to now move on to my colleague, Niloy.
Yeah, hi everyone. Let me demonstrate a brief overview of Bangladesh now. Bangladesh is currently the world's eighth most populous country. It has about 2.5 times the population of United Kingdom, with over 161 million people, but 2 times less space. Its GDP per capita is about $1,700 US, where UK's GDP per capita is almost $43,000. So you can get the difference here. According to World Bank, it has one of the fastest growing economies in South Asia. As a result, people in Bangladesh are experiencing rapid urbanization, overcrowding, numerous kinds of environmental pollution, and unequal distribution of wealth. Along with the emergence of modernity and capitalism, Bangladesh has also experienced temporal transition. For instance, agriculture-based Bengali calendar has been gradually replaced by Gregorian calendar. People once expressed time with the Bengali notion of Bela. Nowadays, expression of time has become more industrial. People mostly depend on modern clock time. So there are two major political parties in Bangladesh who also entrenched their temporal changes to establish the historical narratives of those parties. For example, the party which comes to power introduces their own events and holidays to the calendar, and people have to follow them. So now let's get into the overview of Bangladeshi higher education sector. The overlapping timescapes in higher education sector is connected to the British colonialism, which started in 1757 in Bangla. The public universities in Bangladesh were first established by the British Raj. The first university was established in 1921. On the other hand, the private universities were introduced in 1990s. They mostly follow the American models. So temporal differences can be observed in the public and private sectors in the context of state politics, accountability, hiring, and research funding. We focused on the universities situated on the greater region of Dhaka for three main reasons. Firstly, this is the capital and the largest city in Bangladesh in terms of area and population. Secondly, Dhaka is the hub of higher education in Bangladesh. 55 private and 11 public higher education institutions are located in Dhaka, including numerous affiliated institutions of 2 public universities who also offer higher degrees. Thirdly, Dhaka is experiencing rapid economic and infrastructural growth. So we could connect with a diverse pool of respondents based on gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, and region. Next, Emma will demonstrate the idea of Shomoiscape that we used here. Let's get back to her. Thank you. Emma.
Emma, you need to unmute.
Oh, I'm very sorry.
I've done it many times, don't worry.
Okay, everyone. So in this paper, we introduce to you the notion of Shomoiscape. This notion is primarily built on Barbara Adams' idea of timescape. Like timescape, Shomoiscape also denotes the assemblage of temporal features. It also denotes the inseparability of time, space, and context. And it talks about how time is experienced differently due to social difference. But you see, during this project, we noticed that timescape is just not enough when we talk about the temporality in Bangladesh. That is when we coined a more culturally sustaining idea, Shomoiscape. Firstly, like the global north, yes, in a lot of cases, there is the presence of a self-sufficient autonomous self here in Bangladesh. But way more powerful than that is the collective nature of Bengali culture. This partly stems from the ever-present precarity in almost all aspects here. And in response to this precarious situation, people depend on family or extended family networks for social support. This collective nature is seen in many aspects of life, including temporality. That is why time in Bangladesh is almost always relational, almost always relational. The social hierarchy here is also very, very explicit. This hierarchy can be in terms of class, gender, age even. This hierarchy, it decides whose time is more valuable, and due to it, elders and workplace seniors are often privileged. For example, suppose in an academic event or a seminar, that seminar can't be started because a workplace senior has not yet arrived yet, even though that person might not have anything to do or any role in that event. Secondly, time in Bangladesh is non-linear and recursive. Commodification and scheduling of time are often resisted, as we've shown you in the coach that Dr. S. Riyad sir presented earlier. But at the same time, due to global capital, time here is sometimes linear as well. And finally, the modern and traditional notion of temporality is intertwined and enmeshed together in Bangladesh. For example, we celebrate both the Gregorian New Year and also Pahla Boishakh, which is the Bangla New Year. So you see, Shomoiscape incorporates all these notions and enables us to get a better understanding of temporality in Bangladesh. In the following discussion, we will explain to you the Shawmyscape of our respondents and how they navigate it. Thank you.
Sorry, let me quickly unmute myself. All right, thank you so much, Niloy and Emma, for setting the context of some of the larger context in which we're talking about. But to continue with context, this is just to give you a sense of the data sources from which we derive our findings as well as the study itself. So we basically went about in Dhaka, and this is right before COVID. We were there in February and March, where we conducted semi-structured interviews with 22 Bangladeshi academics. We did campus visits as well as observations across 4 different universities located in Dhaka. 2 of these are public research universities, 2 of them are private universities. Our respondents were composed of females and males. 11 were senior, 11 were junior. Most of them were Bengali Muslims, which is the dominant population. There were 2 Bengali Hindus and 1 ethnic minority. We had participants ranging from the hard sciences to biomedical to humanities and fine arts. And this is something very interesting when we're talking about the question of time. Disciplines play a major role of what a faculty life is like. And that's something important for us to really interrogate, not to universalize time as something that is simple, same across the university, but the departments and disciplines shape a faculty's life. So we conducted 60 to 80-minute semi-structured interviews. We asked them, we covered it all the way from the aspects of our academic life, like roles, tasks, trajectory, academic career, work-life balance, but also their perceptions of time, their relationships and dilemmas with time, and the role of affect in such temporal context. And then we conducted data analysis through open coding, and we used writing as a method of inquiry to tease out and articulate what we saw were some major ideas that were emerging. So the argument that we're going to make here is that we argue that Bangladeshi faculty negotiate their Shawmyscapes by subjectively responding to the external precarity. As Emma put it, precarity seemed to be the norm. It's not unusual, but the norm, which were evoked by larger spatial, structural, or cultural temporal forces. In this talk today, we're going to illuminate how Shawmyscapes manifest through various temporal forces. Number 1, through traffic. You probably heard a bit of traffic when Niloy was talking. Number 2, party-based university politics. And finally, 3, the future of others. So Emma is going to talk a little bit about what we found in terms of traffic.
I apologize in advance if there's a lot of back noise here. This is one of the examples of the pollution that Niloy was talking about. So if you have trouble or difficulty hearing me, so please let me know. So moving on to the discussion. Traffic in Bangladesh is referred to as traffic jam, not just traffic jam, because traffic deters mobility, causing spatial temporal discontinuity, meaning that traffic halts one's movement across space and also time. But what's interesting is that in Bangladesh, the existence of traffic is non-negotiable. And as people can't negotiate traffic, they negotiate various temporal categories to fit around traffic. For example, if we think of traffic as a pin on a board, that pin stays fixed while other things in the board are moved to fit around it, thus causing a displacement of temporal categories. This displacement occurs in 3 ways. First, in our respondents' attempts to avoid traffic. For instance, one respondent wakes up at 4 a.m., works out a little, takes his breakfast and leaves for his work by 6. And because if he leaves any later than that, he will face a great deal of traffic jam and will not get a place for parking his car at work. However, after he reaches work, he doesn't actually work for 5 hours. Instead, he finishes the rest of his morning rituals, like taking tea, a proper breakfast, reading the paper. Here we see how various temporal categories like his body time, me time, family time are displaced in order to avoid traffic. Next slide, please, Dr. S. In the next slide, we show you how, Dr. S, the next slide, please. In the next slide we talk about another theme we found, instrumentalizing traffic time. This is another way that traffic displaces the temporal categories in one's life. Our respondent, Isha, lives pretty far away from her workplace, which makes her spend a lot of time on the road. She has a car and is offered to drive her to places. She tells us that she makes the best use of traffic jam, as you can see that I bolded out in the slide. She tells us that, and we ask her, how does she do that? So she tells us she does all the calls she has to do during traffic, both family calls and networking. She also does class preparation during traffic, even though she prefers to do it at night at home. Here we see her Showmyscape consists of class prep time, and also networking time, family time, and traffic time. And as traffic stole away time from other categories, she made up for it by reallocating other categories like class preparation, networking, or calling relatives. Here, this displacement, the displacement we're talking about, displacement of temporal categories is seen. There are other things to note here, other interesting things like Isha can't leave home early to avoid traffic like our previous respondent. And the reason for that is her father-in-law. Her father-in-law lives with her and her husband, and she has to have breakfast or dinner at home, mainly to spend some time with him. She insists on that. That is why she can't just avoid traffic like our previous respondent. This is a good example of how Showmyscape is relational. Her Showmyscape is also an excellent example of the coexistence of local or relational time and linear time. And we see that this coexistence has occurred because of communication technology, as she has the opportunity to call from car in traffic time. The next slide, please. Press the next slide, please. In the next slide, we show you how transforming commute time into collective social time was another way that traffic displaced temporal categories. This happens for respondents who use university transportation. Neela is such a respondent. She lives far away from campus. It takes up to 3 or 4 hours daily to go and come back from work for her. She tells us that this traffic time steals time away from her social time. And interestingly, in response, she has formed a social group with her colleagues who also use the same bus, thus making up for this social time that she can't have because of traffic. This social group, they listen to music together, they go out to dine together, and so forth. This just didn't stop at being a social group. Their time together also opened up doors for research collaboration for them. As you can see that I bolded out in the quote in the slide. A thing to note here is that Neela doesn't enjoy the same temporal autonomy in deciding when she gets to leave work or leave home as our first two respondents. That is because her schedule is restricted by the bus schedule. So Neela's Showmyscape consists of fixed bus schedule, social time, networking time, and traffic time. And here, her social time and networking time are displaced and then merged with traffic time. So up next, Niloy will tell you about university politics. Thank you.
Hi, I'm back. So let me talk about university politics a bit. Before we start, I want to remind ourselves again that the university politics we are talking about here is not a mere departmental or internal politics. University politics dominant in the Bangladeshi public universities is mainly national political party-based politics. This phenomenon stems from a structural spatiotemporal reality because the public universities had a major role in political upsurges in the history of Bangladesh, such as the 1952 language movement, 1971 liberation war, and so on. So basically, university politics is a dominant temporal force in the respondents' Showmyscapes as it demands time from our respondents. By demanding time, we mean that university politics compels our respondents to attend to politics while draining time from non-political temporal categories such as teaching, research, family time, personal time, and so on. Consequently, respondents face precarity regarding their career trajectory. Sometimes respondents face frequent momentary precarity regarding the temporal categories in their Showmyscapes. Moreover, the intervention of university politics restricts the faculty having their necessary timeless time needed for research and or teaching. So while exploring these happenings, I will also gradually explain how university politics demands time from the respondents' lives. So let's look into Shobuj's narrative first. Can we go to the next slide, please? So yeah. Shobuj is a professor in a public university. His Shomoyscape consisted of teaching, research, students' well-being, family life, and political activism. According to Shobuj, university politics stifled university administration from functioning smoothly, as there were no set guidelines for evaluating academic activities like teaching or research. Consequently, according to him, faculty supporting the ruling party-based political factions were preoccupied with their promotion and access to resources through politicking. So they get a promotional advantage in their career because of the ruling party alignment. Shobuj, however, resisted ruling party-based university politics and is instead engaged in anti-establishment activities. Rejecting the time demanded by the ruling party-based university politics puts Shobuj at a promotional disadvantage. Simultaneously, engaging in anti-establishment activism also demanded time. So either way, university politics drained time from Shobuj's Shomoyscape. Although he is passionate of his research and teaching, he is not certain what would happen to his career, promotion, etc. He faces precarity regarding his career trajectory. However, if we claim that ruling party affiliated faculty can always avoid such precarity, that would be untrue. The next example is of Zareen. Can we move to the next slide, please? So, Zareen is an associate professor and chair of a social science department in a public university. Her Shomoyscape consisted of her administrative duties, teaching, childcare, and scholarship. So this happened right on the day we took her interview. We can see the quote in the presentation here. In this quote, we can see that she negotiated her childcare duties to greet her VC at a celebration event. She calls it professionalism, but considering the argument by Schultz demonstrated here, this is more of a political activity than a professional one. So her childcare duty is momentarily interrupted and became uncertain, while university politics demanded time from her Shomoyscape. Unlike Shobuj, who faced long-term career-related precarity, Zareen faced frequent but temporary precarity in her Shomoyscape. The former part of our interview with Zareen was constantly interrupted as she worked rampantly with her colleagues series to align the title with the celebration of the 100th birthday of the father of the nation. We heard her concerns about how the university leadership expected Zareen, teaching was her main occupation. She prioritized teaching activities the most, like taking classes, exams, or grading. But the interview session and the question drafting, which was a part of her teaching activities, came to a standstill for that moment. During the interview, whenever a proposed speaker series came up, Zareen prioritized that over everything. Thus, non-political temporal categories like childcare and teaching in Zareen's Shomoyscape faced momentary precarity. And lastly, for some respondents, university politics siphons off their timeless time. Jamal, a professor of science, had to navigate such a Shomoyscape. He heavily prioritized his research, and timeless time was an important feature in his Shomoyscape. However, as Jamal noted, and I stated earlier, public university administration cannot function properly because of politics. He shared the issues of nepotism and his discontent towards the university administration imposing duties on him. As a professor of a public research university, Jamal believed that he should focus more on research. Thus, according to Jamal, unnecessary duties informed by the politically influenced university administration restrict his timeless time. So we can simply say that Shobuj, Jamal, and Zareen's experiences encapsulate how university politics invokes different precarious situations by demanding time from faculty's lives. In the next part, Dr. Riyad will talk about the future of others. So let's get back to him. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Emma and Niloy, for talking about, so far we've talked about the question of place, social structure, and this time we're going to talk about something that is more about the amorphous not yet. And so here, one of the dominant concerns that emerged, particularly when we talked to faculty about their career trajectories, was the role of collective culture. So here we want to suggest that one's Shawmyscape often always overlap with the future of others that are also entangled with their past. And so by future of others, we're talking about the well-being of one's parents, children, and or family. As I mentioned earlier, this was a dominant concern among faculty as they share their career trajectories, even their daily temporal rhythms. For instance, some of the faculty used to work outside of the academy, left their prestigious jobs, say, for instance, an international NGO to work in the academy because of the temporal autonomy, i.e. the flexibility with time that they could have by being an academic. Another participant mentioned how they moved from one institution to another institution because they were looking for more temporal autonomy because they have a child with special needs. In other words, the future of others was shaping many of our faculty's career trajectories as well as their aspirations. But also it informed their daily temporality in terms of issues around family property, childcare, elderly care, and so forth. So in other words, people's Shawmyscapes was always, faculty Shawmyscapes was often always entangled with the timescape of others, particularly loved ones. So here's one example. This is an example of Mahmoud, who did his PhD in the West and actually moved back to Bangladesh because he was very concerned about the family health of his father and mother and so forth. But here he talks about the affective entanglements with time. He talks about how when we were interviewing him, he was so preoccupied at work with a battle around land in his village. And this was land that was inherited by his mother from her mother. And so here he's talking about how he cannot do work if family members are upset. So he says, I cannot do anything, so that's my first priority is to take care of them. Now, then he talks about how the government is basically coming and taking over to create a rail line or platform. They're acquiring lands, and so his mother's upset. And so because she's upset, he's preoccupied looking after this. And so he talks about how he gets involved with the local government, Gunda Panda, which are like thugs, the local politicians, financial matters, and the police to deal with these family property issues. So here what you're seeing is an example of by which Shawmyscapes is constituted again by the future of others that encompasses the future, in other words, future ownership of his family's land, the past, in other words, the inheritance that his mother has received, and the present, the mother's well-being. So he's basically navigating all these timescapes simultaneously. Furthermore, his temporal rhythm, by being involved in trying to take care of this land issue, is further entangled with the temporal rhythms of the government offices, police, and local politicians. So in other words, one's Shawmyscape is always entangled with others because of the collective nature, because of the relational nature of time, okay? The next slide is from Neela. We introduced Neela when we talked about how she converted traffic time into more of a collective social time. And Neela is very interesting because not only was she a faculty in the natural sciences in a public university, but she constantly collaborated with colleagues in the West. She also got her PhD mostly in Asia, but she still collaborates. And she was comparing her experiences with her colleagues in Sweden. And here she talks about the lack of social infrastructure in schooling, broader security, which all acted as temporal constraints. So when she compares her experiences with her Swedish colleagues, she talks about how she points out that the childcare facilities in Sweden are better. The schooling facilities are so good. And for her, because of that lack, she has to be so involved and preoccupied with extracurricular activity of her son. They have to go to different schools, recitation. And then she points out that, you know, unlike her colleagues in Sweden who may have time for the weekends to spend time with the family, instead she is preoccupied with commuting with her son to different types of classes, right? As she said that, you know, even if I'm free, I can't do this because my child is not free. So in other words, her temporality, her Shawmyscape was always to entangle with her son. Now that's because childcare and family care is very much gendered. And we've seen numerous studies in the Bangladeshi context talking about female academics facing significant barriers in their career trajectories and work-life balance. So here we see an example in which Niloy's Shomyscape was an assemblage of schooling infrastructure, broader social security, and children's well-being. And here we're seeing how Nila is reacting to a precarious Shomyscape instigated by the future of others. So this just gives you kind of a little snapshot of our study. And in conclusion, here's a couple of things we want to leave you with. One is that in the Bangladeshi context, there are no autonomous or discrete temporal boundaries, as the temporal categories are implicated in each other, are entangled with others. Furthermore, the three temporal forces we talked about that seem to be salient in our participants' lives. One is traffic, the party-based university politics, as well as the future of others. To varying degrees, displays, demanded, and entangles one's timescape. The larger precarity within a global South urban context creates multifaceted temporal constraints and introduces complex Shomyscapes in our faculty lives. One of the things that I think is different about the Bangladeshi context, or here a global South urban context, is temporal autonomy is not individualistic. Rather, it's always been collective. And what's so interesting is that in many ways, these temporal forces that are tied to entanglements in collective temporality were forces to, in many ways, to resist modern clock times of productivity and so forth. So it offered a means of deceleration rather than the acceleration we see in other parts of the world. And one of the key themes that emerge for us is that precarity is the norm. It seems to be salient, not only in the conditions within the halls of the universities, but the larger precarity in society that has larger repercussions on faculty lives. So to end with some future research directions, we see we were wondering how these Shomyscapes converge or vary across institutional types or regions of Bangladesh. How does Shomyscapes look similar or vary in other rapidly developing economies like Central Asia, Central America, or Vietnam? And how do you revisit the scholarship of academic temporality from global South perspectives? And what new questions can we ask? And how does Shomyscapes vary for global South faculty who experience academic mobility? With that, we end here and we can open up for Q&A.
Wow. Thank you very much. Thank you, Riyad. Thank you, Niloy. Thank you, Emma. You really opened up quite a lot of interesting questions, and I think gave us methods with which we can all work to think about specific contexts and temporality, which is clearly going to be a major area of inquiry for us. I'm going to ask you later on about research on scale and research on temporality and how that intersects. And I've got a specific question about that, but let me start with a more mundane question, which just opens up further, I think, what you've already been talking about. And then I'll bring in some of the questions in the chat, David Mills and Rashid Mahmood and David Locke, I think in that order. My mundane question is really about understanding how these unpredictable and open-ended parts of the Shomyscape intersect with faculty work. Because clearly lots of time is spent on things which can't be predicted, like traffic and politics. I mean, politics is one of those open-ended things that, you know, demands a lot of affect, a lot of energy, and you don't know what it's going to do to the next few hours or the next few days or the next few years. But then faculty work in the form of teaching and intersection with students and is it more predictable? And what about research and scholarship? I mean, obviously the point about precarity underlines this discussion as well. But how do those unpredictable large blocks of time, how do they affect the capacity to pursue a research and scholarship agenda, given that you do need that sort of space where you can withdraw for a while and think and write and so on? And if that's constantly being disrupted, it's very hard to think and write, as we all know. So how does the Shomyscapes of the faculty that you've been speaking to, how are they affecting their capacity to do research and write and as active scholars? So that's two questions. One is the teaching part. Is that more predictable, more manageable than a lot of other things in the Shomyscape? And the second question is about research and scholarship. how does that affected by these shomascapes that we're talking about?
Great questions, and I'd love to hear what Emma and Niloy says, but a couple of things. First of all, let's begin by talking about research. So again, we're looking at 22 academics, we're looking at people in Dhaka context, private and public universities. There is a lack of research infrastructure in Bangladesh, period. I mean, yes, there are now UGCs coming with some merit stuff, things like that. But one of the things that we found, particularly among our colleagues in the public universities, that many of them who are actively involved in research are usually has two reasons. One is because they've been socialized in the West. In other words, they worked somewhere else and they brought that kind of temporal discipline back to Bangladesh. And the second, they were intrinsically motivated. In other words, there were no external pressures to do research, right? So in many ways, when you're talking about Shomascape, those who are intrinsically motivated try to find means to do research, apply for grants, things like that. Okay, so that's number one. Teaching was a bit more structured. It was more predictable than, for instance, research because of the autonomy involved in research, as well as the structures involved, the lack of structures involved in research, unless you're doing like funded projects, which often were funded by, NGOs and things like that, not like by government, even though there are some, but very scarce, right? But now this is where the types of universities played a role. So in the so-called American kind of model of these corporate private universities, teaching was something that was scheduled. There was an academic calendar and most people followed that. That was not the case, according to our participants, in the context of public universities. Because in public universities, given what we just talked about, party-based politics, things like that, and Emma and Niloy, who are public university students, can tell you, when I was visiting some of these public universities, I was talking to students, and the student would say, "Sir, I have to go to a class." 5 minutes later, they come back and they tell me, "Sorry, sir, I can spend more time with you because class is canceled." In other words, the class time is not even regulated. It changes, right? So it's interesting. One of the things that our colleagues who are in public university, it was a sense of pride for them that they would actually go and teach on time, that they would actually meet a schedule, right? Because in many ways, according to them, that is in itself is not the norm, right? So in terms of the Shomascapes, there are a couple of facets. One is as I said, research is intrinsically motivation. Second, teaching, it varied really between the public versus the private universities, because again, corporate time, modern time was very lodged in the private versus the public universities. That is not to say that public university faculty are not engaged in the academic calendar and so forth, but it was much more precarious in the public universities than the private. Does that answer your question, Simon?
It's great. Really striking how politicized public universities are, and not dissimilar to the situation in India in that regard, where public university faculty are really, caught up in. I mean, my colleagues at JNU, for example, were totally absorbed much of the time by the political and national political issues and the way they play out in the university context, quite deliberately so. And in the case of JNU, let me bring in David Mills. Welcome, David.
Great. Yes, thank you. That was really fascinating, colleagues. It was lovely to have a collaborative presentation and for you to attend to issues of precarity and how that just dominates people's lives and the affective dimensions. The traffic stuff was really great. So my question really is one just to push a little further on whether one ends up with a timescape that's totally detached from an international academic system with its expectations and pressures, because there is a risk of sort of saying, right, well, almost in resistance to modern time, Bangladesh time is different. And globalization has taught us that we're not separate, we are interlinked. So my question really was around, in particular, how efforts to reform universities might be introducing sort of some of these sort of accelerated times. And I'm really speaking from looking at a lot of Ghanaian data that we've been analyzing, where young researchers, very focused on how frustrating publication cycles were with local journals, because it was so slow and they wanted to get on, they wanted to get promoted. So of course they would turn to international journals, and a constant frustration around time there. That's just an example, but your thoughts on that would be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I want to wait to see. Emma, Niloy, do you want to quickly respond to that, or do you want me to do it? Just want to make sure they get a chance to talk too.
Of course, yeah.
Well, I want to hear the question again. Can you please rephrase? I mean, did you talk about how? I mean, let me read it.
So it's really about. Go on, after you.
Did you talk about reformations or UGC reformations or something?
That was an example.
Okay. I think there. Let's what I can say, like say UGC tries to reform. The UGC focuses on how public universities would work and how private universities would work. The mechanisms are slightly different. Public and private university mechanisms are slightly different. UGC has more control over the private universities, and there are some public universities who are there is an act called 1973 Act, and it gives more autonomy for public universities. So public universities are relatively autonomous, but UGC negotiates with them, and UGC monitors their activities. Say research nowadays. This is very recent. UGC has called for monitoring the research in public universities. So they do that, but. One thing I want to mention that when policymakers they monitor and they give some instruction. Sometimes I think there is a gap. There is a gap between how the actors or how people are in the university, how they're working, or what reality they are facing. Like when about publishing journals, say private university. When we talk with private university respondents, they always say that to get a promotion or to get recognized, they always have to publish in Scopus Index journals, not local journals. Inside Bangladesh, they have to publish in Scopus Index journals. So there are many other complex politics here, global politics, and it's sometimes it's an issue about global north versus global south, I think, in some cases. So and there are other difficulties, like there is lack of resources, lack of research infrastructure. So I think that it creates a gap with the policy making of UGC and the university structure in Bangladesh. Thank you.
I would add, David, thank you for that question, because I think what you're raising is a question of globalization of time, really, right? In other words, I think this is one of the things that we need to think about as temporal scholars, is that policy reforms is embedded by particular types of timescapes assumed within the policy templates in itself, right? So when you talk about international academic systems and so forth, we're talking about, being published in certain types of academic indexes and so forth, which tends to be a big part of policy reform in Africa and many other parts like Asia and so forth. I do work around global rankings, and they're very interconnected. Now, this is why Bangladesh is a very unique case study, because in the public universities, you don't feel that kind of pressure that you feel in other parts of the world. But also, I want to complicate that narrative that I just shared. It's very much discipline-based, David. And that's something we need to be very careful about. So for instance, when we talk to folks in the humanities or per se in like design art or something, this is not the kind of thing we're talking about, because they're publishing in local journals, books, things like that, right? We're really, what you're talking about often is applied to the sciences. So now what's very interesting is that, we interviewed faculty in the sciences, and what's unique about our study is that we also have participants who also either socialized or worked in the West and then came back, or like some folks worked in Japan and things like that. These are the faculty we saw who are more research active, because they've been socialized, they've been introduced to this research infrastructure, this culture of being published in SSCI journals, things like that, or the science-based journal. And they brought that culture with them. And they were frustrated with the existing local culture and with their local colleagues, because they felt like they wanted to do capacity building at home by bringing their Japanese or the European mindsets. And they were trying to push and frustrated by the local politics and things, because they wanted to focus on the research. So my answer to your question is, yes, it is apparent in the public universities, in particular disciplines, by particular faculty who've been socialized in other parts of the world. But as Niloy pointed, in the private university, you see this culture of I would say the corporate culture of publishing more prevalent but not in the same acceleration levels that I have studied in the UK, US, Australia, and other parts of the world, or even China, for instance, right? So I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Emerging but uneven. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that interesting discussion. I'd like to bring in Rashid Mahmood at this point. Can you ask your question, Rashid?
Okay, thank you very much. It's been really amazing and good to see Professor Riyad presenting his research finding, which had been done along with two of my, direct students, Niloy and Emma. And
okay.
Hey, hello, Riyad, how are you?
Yeah, it's great to meet you. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, I've been here, the entire time and was, listening to your fantastic presentation. And just, to let everybody know that I'm from a public university and I do teach, in a public university in Bangladesh. So my question to the research team is that the party-based politics, which, the university teachers take part in, is it always compelling or they have the chance not to get involved in the national politics based university politics? That's my first question. And the second question is something to do with the notion of precarity in terms of the Shomoscape that you mentioned. My question is the Shomoscape or the timescape, is it always connected to the precarities that you mentioned, or there are some other elements that could have been considered here, like anti-research mentality, or taking or using Shomoscape in personal advantage, for personal advantage. Is there any other element connected to the elements connected to the Shomoscape? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Mahmood, for being here. It's such a pleasure to have someone from Bangladesh talking to us. I think your question about whether or not party-based university politics is always compelling, I would say the answer is no, it's not always there, but the ones we spoke to, it did emerge as a powerful force, which is also unique to Bangladesh, and hence this is why we focus here. But does that mean it's always there and people resist or not partake in it? Absolutely. So for instance, which is interesting, particularly the faculty that we interviewed who came from the sciences were either just didn't care about it, especially those who were socialized in the West. They were frustrated by it, but they didn't partake in it. But they did complain, for instance, about the case that, it got in the way. I mean, party-based politics, no matter what, you may not participate, but you're always implicated, right? Whether it's the students. So for instance, one faculty member mentioned that, people will, if you're not aligned, people will use excuses. Students, based on their party-based politics, will give you evaluations, complain about you, things like that. That kind of thing would happen. So to answer your question, it is not compelling in people's agency, but it is part of the landscape that you cannot ignore in the public university space. That doesn't mean that there are people who are not involved. That doesn't mean that people are always doing that. They're also involved with other things. Your question about precarity and Shomoscape is a very interesting one. So right now in this paper, we only talk about 3 areas. I mean, we didn't even go into many other details of precarity that emerges. So yes, something that's also important to talk about in terms of Shomoscape is also the question of social difference, right? In other words, the positionality of the subject matters in terms of whether or not where you are in class, gender, ethnicity, and all those things, what kind of university you work on, all play a role on whether or not precarity is something that is salient in your life or not. So the themes that we talked about were the themes that emerged across, again, as I said, the party-based university politics does not apply in the case of the private university sector, but there are other elements of Shomoscapes where precarity may not be the factor per se. Like there were people, what was very interesting to us, Dr. Mahmood, and this is a paper I'm going to write about, is it's so interesting for those who have been socialized in West, in other words, those who worked outside of Bangladesh, the way they brought certain temporal rhythms in their life. For instance, one colleague talked about walking dogs. As you know, Bangladesh, many people don't have pets, or if they do, they don't walk their dogs. It's a very new phenomenon, right? The pet culture. So he studied in Australia. He now uses dogs and so forth. The person we talked about who likes to wake up very early in the morning, he studied in the United States, and he brought this culture of taking care of yourself. You know, it was very interesting. One of the other, just to answer your question in another way, one of the things we asked participants is describe your life daily. Like, what does an average day look like when you wake up till you sleep? And that gave us a sense of the temporal categories in which people allocated time in their daily life. What was interesting, and you probably know this, Dr. Mahmood, is that the ones who were in the West ate dinner earlier. Which was very interesting, because people in Bangladesh on average eat dinner late. It's precarious. Their dinner time is precarious. But those who worked in the West would eat around 6. And I said, so when they said that, I said, oh, where did that come from? They said, oh, when I lived in UK, when I lived in America, where I lived in Australia. So that's another way to talk about Shomayscape, that is not just about local precarity and so forth, but also other cultures informing one's understanding and time maps of daily life. I don't know if that answers your question. And Emma and Niloy, you're welcome to say anything you want to add.
Yeah, I want to add something. I want to introduce him again. Rashid sir is my teacher. I'm a student, and it's very great to see him in this presentation. I'm presenting before my direct teacher, so it's very great for me. So you asked about if they can get the chance, or if they have that opportunity to not get involved. I would say yes, that. Yeah, I mean, the examples I have shown, you can see that there are examples that they try to resist that party-based politics or the party-based temporal force. They try to resist that. They try to involve in anti-establishment activities or other activities. So, but I argue that it does not mean that getting not involved removes precarity from their life, or getting or that precarious situation that that is created by party-based university politics, that does not get removed if they do not get involved. That stays there. They faces precarity or disease, or their resistance, or they when they don't want to get involved. That may be a response to that precarity created by party-based university politics. So that's it. Thank you, sir.
Can I add something very quickly? As Dr. Shahjahan was talking about, even if you resist university politics, this is still part of the landscape. And Niloy just told us how it causes the precarious situation. I'm just going to give an example to clarify this. In Shobuj's example, Shobuj talks about the fact that if you are connected politically, for your promotions, you don't need as much publication as someone who's not connected. So this is how the precarious university politics is part of the landscape. That means that promotion and other facilities are influenced by the fact that you are or you're not in university politics. So that is how it's part of the landscape. That is all that I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for that interesting discussion. I think we've got time for David Locke.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the presentation. Just a quick observation and a question. I thought it strange when I went out to do a study for the British Council about 10 years ago, that all of the rectors in public sector universities that I'd spoken to had been in post for precisely 2 months. And that, of course, was the political effect. There had been a change of government and so on. Mm-hmm. And so my observation is that what you've been talking about has an effect far beyond the actual work of academics and what they do and their promotion, but an effect for the whole policy and leadership of higher education in Bangladesh. But my question is this. During the recent pandemic, it's become more normal to work from home and to communicate by Teams and Zoom and things like that. I'm just wondering, to what extent has that happened in Bangladesh? And if it has happened in Bangladesh, do you see this altering things in the future and enabling academics to give more priority to their work and the other things that they give priority to?
So I'm going to leave that to Niloy and Emma to answer, because I was there before COVID, and after COVID, a lot has changed. So I'll let them answer that question.
So I'm going to start. I think what you said, firstly, includes the fact that how are things during the COVID situation? Are our faculties getting the chance to work, focus more on work? So here, there is a clear distinction in public and private universities. You see, the public universities, they have a wide range of students who live. There are people who live in Dhaka, and there are the students who live in distant parts of the country where there is not even internet connection. So as a response, public universities decided to stop all academic procedures, all academic activities. So in this time, what happened is that the academics, the faculties in public universities, they didn't get to take as much class as they used to before the COVID situation. Some faculties did take classes online, but that the frequency of that wasn't really increased in any way. Rather, it was decreased. But in the private university scenario, the private university students, since private university costs more. So I think this is just a personal opinion. Private university students have the ability to access the internet and attend online classes. That is why the private universities continued their classes and academic activities. So the private university faculties ended up, focusing more on their work, I think. So this is the distinction in private and public university. And as to your second question, do we see this continuing in the future? I think that this might have some implications for the future. The fact that a lot of the things that we have to be physically present to do, we don't really have to be physically present to do those anymore. These might have implications for private universities more than they have implications for public ones, because it's been very clear that the public universities, since they have a wide range of students, online classes or not being physically there is not really one of the best options to choose. So that is all I have to add. If Niloy or Dr. S has anything else to add. Thank you.
Just quickly related to that, I see, Simon, you've given me a question that we need to answer. How much time do we have, Simon? Just to...
Well, I don't think we do have time for more discussion. I'm going to ask you one more question myself.
Okay, so go ahead, Niloy.
We usually close about 5 past, so...
Okay, Niloy, do you want to say something quickly and then we answer Simon's last question?
No, I think you have covered everything, and Ima is much more experienced about this because she's still in undergraduate and she's taking class on. I am already completed my graduation, post-graduation. So
yeah, Simon, what was your question?
Yeah, well, really, I want to close, but ask a question right at the end as well. I want to thank Riyad and Niloy and Emma. I mean, I think that was really articulate, really effective presentation, but good slides. But what you did today was that you opened up an important area of research. You also opened up Bangladesh and faculty life in Bangladesh, and you didn't close it. You didn't seek to put a normative frame on it, which gave it all the answers and gave us your interpretation as the only possible answer. So really appreciate that way of discussing the topic. Welcome to come back again to contribute further to our global discussion. And we really need to learn more about Bangladesh. I thought there were many interesting things that came up, and I really liked the way Riyad talked about intersecting Shahjahanscapes, between different people, and this is a way to think about relationality, I think. And we can think your first instinct when you hear the word Shahjahanscapes and you see the data is you think individual Shahjahanscapes, but of course they're partly shared, aren't they? They're partly collective as well. And sometimes they're quite large collectivities. So we move between these individualized Shahjahanscape experiences and we move into these relational and collective parts of our time as well. So I think, and that as a way to think about individuality and collectivity, this is very helpful. So, I mean, relationality seems to me so fundamental in social theory, and, you know, in so many of our structure agency problems occur because we don't have enough fluidity about relationality in there. And your showmascapes give us devices empirically and theoretically to think about relationality in a new way. So really good. Now my question's about scale and time, because, you know, we know that according to Kant, if he's still right, that where the time and space frame our imaginaries, and, you know, the frame our agency in many respects, our possibilities are in terms of time and space, but they're not the same thing, are they? The fourth dimension is not the same as the other three. There's a lot of different, you know, they're not equivalent. They're heterogeneous in lots of ways. So the intersection between space and temporality, I think, is also an area of potential research. Now the question is, to try and make that concrete, the question is this. I mean, we know that and Riyad, of course, has contributed magnificently to this literature. We know that the distinction between a national way of seeing and a local way of seeing, institutional or faculty group, and a global way of seeing can be very different, and that difference can be important. Does temporality change when you move between scale? If you move from, we talked a bit about faculty who are active internationally and how that changed their local experiences. But does their temporality change as well?
Perfect question, and a focus of our paper in the future. I do agree that it does change, but they are not either absent. It's not like, oh, you go to global and then you have the global time regime, you go to the local and now you have the local regime. I mean, that's one of the problems we have. And, you know, like your global local heuristic suggests that it's not just spatial, but they're trans. In other words, they're always penetrating and informing each other. And I think that's what really the Showmascape is really trying to encompass, is to move away from the notion of individual temporality to talk about broader issues, broader timescapes that are at play. We cannot ignore, no matter where you are in the world, that clock time is a Western construct. It is not a construct from all over the world. The word seconds only came after 1867, when you started the pendulum clock, right? And that was something that was the clock, and this is where my colleagues in Kyoto University do a great job talking about how clock time was introduced into Japan and reformed the whole society through industrial time, right? So we cannot ignore that. Everyone says Happy New Year. That's based on the Gregorian calendar of a Christian calendar, right? Yes. So my point is that no matter what, global timescapes shapes everywhere. The question is how people are negotiating that within context, right? And that's where I think the notion of global heuristic could be complicated from a temporal lens, because what we're seeing here is no matter where you go, time affects your life. Whether you're talking about time in terms of the clock, linear time, but also the way you make sense of time, because it's all affectively attached, right? So for instance, I'm doing work around decolonizing pedagogy and time right now. And so one of the ways a lot of students resist decolonizing pedagogy by saying you spend too much time talking about your oppression, right? The word too much is about the degree and the allocation of time you spend, right? So that is a temporal element right there. In other words, durations, the tempo, the speed, all those things are variant based on which context you're in. So yeah, I would agree that in terms of scales, I would say two things. Number one, scales influence each other temporally. Even the local timescape that has become global, which is a Western construct, is a local timescape, has been universalized through Christianity, blah, 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 things like that. Second, local timescapes, global timescapes, national timescapes, and this is where the party-based university politics is so salient. It brings a national imaginary, because the party-based politics is about national, right? Oh, yeah. So the imaginary, so when we talked about temporal, you know, Niloy talked about two-party politics. Every time a party comes into power, the national imaginary changes because certain holidays are celebrated over others. In other words, temporality is also tied to national imaginaries. So I don't know if that answers your question, Simon, but I think I would say those two things.
No, it begins to, and there's quite a lot there, actually. Thanks very much, Riyad. And look, let me pay special thanks to Prof. Rashid Mahmood for joining us. Nice that you had this connection with the members of the panel and you were able to interact with them in front of the global audience. That was great. Colleagues, I'm afraid we'll have to call it a day. It's been a great discussion. And let me invite everyone who's still with us to come in in 2 days' time to hear Vicky Bolivar, such an outstanding social researcher in the UK. Perhaps no one is contributing more to the discussion about social inequity in higher education, and she will do a frontal analysis of the operations of the problematic category of merit in the pursuit of fair admissions in universities in England. So that's in 2 days' time at 2 p.m. UK time. And once more, let me give a heartfelt thanks to Riyad, Niloy, and Emma. And good luck with your work. Bye for now. Bye for everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.